Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into, well, an immensely provocative and rhetorically sophisticated document. We're analyzing key excerpts from Pastor John Widdifield's writing, which he titled, quite powerfully, Marxism, the Mind Virus of Hell.
That title, yeah. It's pretty much the perfect summation of the rhetorical strategy we're about to explore here.
Yeah.
Our mission, really, is to quickly but thoroughly understand the core claims. We're not here to debate the politics itself, but to dissect how Widdifield successfully reframed it. He very explicitly tries to move the whole discussion of Marxism away from, the academic or economic sphere,
Right.
and into a theological and spiritual one. He positions it as a fundamental moral pathology, this mind virus, not just, say, a flawed socioeconomic theory. And we need to explore this framework impartially, really analyze the force and the implications of his metaphors.
And what's remarkable, I think, is that Widdifield doesn't exactly ease you into this spiritual framework. Not at all. He starts immediately with a foundational challenge to, well, postmodern thought. He opens with this logical hook that really sets the stage for everything else. He asks, you ever notice how the people who say there's no such thing as truth still get offended when you disagree with them?
Yeah, and that's the crucial starting point, isn't it? Because it establishes this foundational logical inconsistency. It's the entire thesis of Marxism, the mind virus of hell, rests on. Widdifield is basically pointing out that a purely relativistic worldview, where no objective truth exists, it just collapses the moment a personal conviction or boundary is challenged. If truth is entirely subjective, then offense doesn't really mean anything, logically speaking. But because people do get offended, he argues, well, there must be some deeper conviction, right? Some underlying moral structure that they're either violating or trying to enforce.
And he immediately weaponizes that observation. It's quite striking. He doesn't just stop at saying that Marxists or progressives have, broken logic. He claims the ideology didn't just break their logic, it rewired their souls.
Precisely. And that's the moment the mind virus metaphor is fully deployed. It's not subtle. The problem, according to Widdifield, isn't just a failure of intellectual reasoning, bad logic. It's a deep spiritual infection that has corrupted the inner being, the kind of moral operating system of the person who adheres to it. He's essentially telling you, the listener, to view the resulting behavior, the inconsistency, the offense, as symptomatic of a spiritual pathology, not just a political disagreement.
That's a really radical reframing.
It is. It means you're dealing not with an opponent in an argument, but with someone who is, in his view, spiritually ill.
It's an aggressive move, for sure. So, okay, having established that we're dealing with a spiritual condition, not just, a policy paper, Widdifield then defines what this new twisted belief system actually is. Right, this section on Marxism as a twisted religion, it's packed with some of the most memorable and stinging language in the piece. Widdifield defines the ideology as the only religion that starts with envy, worships resentment, and promises salvation through government paperwork. I mean, that is a brutal, concise definition. It deliberately leverages these sacred terms, worship, salvation, to dismantle a secular system.
Yeah, and if you look closely at that definition, you see exactly how Widdifield tries to deconstruct the emotional core of the ideology as he sees it. Most traditional religious frameworks, they might address envy or resentment as sins or maybe moral failings to be overcome. But in Marxism, the mind virus of hell, Widdifield argues the ideology starts with envy and worships resentment, meaning these toxic emotions aren't accidents or side effects.
They're the point.
They're the essential, maybe even holy, substance of the movement. It's a faith built on negative emotional energy. That's his claim.
And that third element, that's what really grounds the critique in cynicism, I think. The promise of salvation through government paperwork. Why is that particular phrase so potent, do you think?
Well, it's the contrast of scale, isn't it? Salvation is this huge term. It implies eternal, cosmic, or, total moral redemption. It's the highest possible spiritual reward you can imagine. By immediately pairing it with government paperwork, Widdifield performs this kind of rhetorical reductio ad absurdum. He reduces the entire political project, all the revolution, the upheaval, the violence he implies, down to just mere bureaucratic shuffling. It trivializes the supposed grandeur of the utopian goal.
Right.
He's essentially saying, you went through all this spiritual corruption, all this destruction. For what? A mediocre administrative adjustment. And that trivialization, it serves to completely undermine the moral authority of the political goal he's critiquing.
Yeah, it strips away any sense of noble intent, doesn't it? And replaces it with something petty, bureaucratic, almost mechanical. And Widdifield doesn't stop at just defining it. He uses these contemporary, really cutting analogies to further damn the ideology. He calls it basically the devil's MLM, multi-level marketing scheme.
Oh, that MLM analogy. It's kind of genius in a dark way. It's modern, cynical, and it resonates immediately with anyone who's, encountered those schemes. And MLM is often associated with these promises of vast returns, easy success. But it's often built on exploiting your social network, requiring endless recruitment. So Widdifield uses this analogy in Marxism, the mind virus of hell, to frame the ideology as inherently exploitative and built on, well, an impossibly flimsy promise.
And he even spells out the promised results, the sort of sales pitch for signing up to this devil's MLM. Sign up your friends, destroy your culture, and you too can achieve utopia. The destruction of culture is listed right there as an explicit step towards the goal. It makes the whole process seem deliberately malicious.
Exactly. The humor of the analogy is darkly layered, isn't it? It's layered with this accusation of deliberate social destruction. It suggests a process where the only way to validate the scheme, the ideology, is to bring down the existing structure, the culture, and recruit more people into the belief system. So it makes the destruction itself an act of faith within this twisted religion, rather than just, say, a regrettable consequence of economic necessity.
But the author immediately counters that. He presents the consequence that inevitably follows this destructive path, creating what we're calling the utopia gulag paradox. He clarifies that this utopian promise is always, always a lie in his view. He writes, "Every utopia Marxism builds turns into a gulag with better branding."
And this moves the argument, doesn't it? From spiritual critique to a kind of historical inevitability. Widdifield is arguing that the very nature of the mind virus, which he says is rooted in envy, resentment, and this desire for external bureaucratic salvation, it actually precludes the possibility of a genuinely good or benevolent society emerging from it. The spiritual corruption, in his framework, guarantees the political failure.
So how does that pride element, which I know we'll get to more, how does that guarantee this failure, this sort of inevitable slide into the gulag, in Widdifield's view?
Well, the guarantee of the gulag, within the framework of Marxism, the mind virus of hell, it stems from this reliance on external force and the rejection of individual transformation. That's key. If the foundation is envy, as he claims, then the only way to satisfy that envy isn't by elevating yourself, but by reducing the object of your envy, the successful, the established, to a lower status. Because the system promises salvation through government paperwork, it necessitates an all-powerful bureaucracy, right? Something capable of enforcing that reallocation. And that power, Widdifield argues, inevitably becomes repressive. The branding might be modern, maybe it's called re-education or equity, but the result, the forced labor, the political repression of the gulag, that's the only possible outcome when you try to enforce a spiritual state, like envy satisfaction, through external, centralized political control. That's the logic he presents.
So if we connect this back to you, the listener, what Widdifield is doing here is really powerful, rhetorically speaking. He shifts the entire terrain of the debate. It's no longer about whether central planning works or not. It's about whether the core moral impulse of the ideology, as he defines it, is inherently corrupting. He forces you to grapple with the underlying morality he attributes to it, envy and resentment.
Absolutely. That shift in the rhetorical frame, that's the single most important element of Marxism, the mind virus of hell. If you accept Widdifield's initial premise that this is fundamentally a spiritual corruption, then you can't really debate interest rates or public spending anymore on his terms. You have to debate the nature of sin, pride, envy, the moral constitution of the human soul. This move attempts to invalidate the purely political discussion before it even gets off the ground. Okay, so to fully understand this virus, Widdifield argues, we have to trace it back to its original host, Karl Marx himself. He moves the diagnosis from the system, the ideology, to the man, claiming Marx wasn't just, a mistaken intellectual, but someone actually possessed by an idea.
That's a significant escalation, isn't it? Possessed. It removes the possibility of historical accident or simple philosophical error. The author is claiming a deliberate spiritual motive guided the creation of the entire philosophy.
And he backs this very highly charged claim in Marxism, the mind virus of hell, with specific citations about Marx's personal beliefs. He claims Marx literally wrote poetry about hating God. Now, this isn't just presented as intellectual atheism. Widdifield is arguing for active malice, a kind of spiritual antagonism. He quotes Marx as saying, "I wish to avenge myself against the one who rules above."
That quote is chilling, and rhetorically, for Widdifield's argument, it's devastating for his opponents if accepted. By presenting this as the foundational motivation, actual vengeance against the divine Widdifield labels the entire philosophy not merely secular, but actively anti-theological. It positions the origin of the ideology as rooted in this deep spiritual rebellion, not just, say, a concern for the industrial working class.
And this narrative construction, it allows Widdifield to label Marx as Satan's intern, which establishes a direct theological lineage for the virus. This claim suggests the philosophy isn't just human error, it's divinely opposed, a spiritually malicious counterproject. And this framework implies that anyone adopting Marx's thought is, whether they know it or not, participating in this ancient spiritual rebellion. That's the implication.
Let's elaborate a bit on the specific vision Marx allegedly rejected, according to Widdifield. The author suggests Marx looked at creation, which he describes in very positive terms. Beautiful, ordered, meaningful, and instead of affirming that existing order, Marx proposed revolution and rage as the answer, the fix.
Right, and that contrast between creation and revolution, that's the core philosophical and spiritual schism Widdifield is identifying. Creation, in this theological view, represents inherent order, beauty, meaning a reflection of divine or natural law. Marx's reaction, framed as revolution and rage, is presented as the absolute rejection of that inherent structure. It's a metaphysical protest, really. Widdifield argues Marx's project is rejecting not just economic systems, but the created reality itself. And the claimed approval of the serpent, good boy, that just reinforces the idea that this entire destructive project is guided by some ancient non-human malevolence.
Okay, so if Marx was the original carrier, and this is framed as a rebellion against order, how does Widdifield explain the mechanism? How does the virus spread to the common person? He claims it taps into the same old infection, pride.
Right. If envy is the spiritual fuel of this twisted religion we talked about in Section 1, then pride is the mechanism that allows the virus to actually infect the individual soul. Widdifield defines pride here not just as arrogance, though that's part of it, but as the fundamental rejection of one's limited place in the created order. It's the belief that your own judgment supersedes established truth or external authority, divine or otherwise.
And he details the specific, kind of insidious nature of this infection. He describes these whispers that appeal to the individual sense of entitlement and resentment. He boils them down into 3 phrases. You deserve better, someone else is to blame, tear it all down.
Those 3 phrases, they're a brilliant distillation of the ideological appeal as Widdifield sees it. Really concise. First, you deserve better. That taps into pride and entitlement, right? Establishes a sense of unfulfilled personal destiny. Second, someone else is to blame. That externalizes fault. It completely eliminates the need for personal accountability or self-reflection. And that's the crucial step for the spiritual infection to take hold, in his view. And third, tear it all down. That provides the action plan. Radical, destructive revolution, which validates the negative emotions that have already been stirred up.
And the consequence, Widdifield argues, that people just swallow this whole. They become convinced they've just discovered justice, when actually, in his words, from Marxism, the mind virus of hell, they've actually downloaded the oldest malware in history. It reframes every revolutionary feeling, every sense of injustice, as just an updated graphical user interface for an ancient, destructive spiritual program.
It does. It connects the current political moment, all the fervor, the rage you see, directly back to the story of Genesis, suggesting that the human heart has merely repurposed the initial temptation. It forces the listener, then, to see the activist not necessarily as a progressive fighter for change, but potentially as a person succumbing to a psychological and spiritual temptation, one they fail to recognize as old and destructive.
This raises a really important question for our listener, I think. If this malware is rooted in pride and resentment, and its initial host was a 19th century philosopher focused on economic class, how does Widdifield claim it manifests successfully in modern Western culture, where, the industrial structures Marx analyzed have significantly evolved? And that shift brings us neatly to Widdifield's assessment of the contemporary political landscape, which he names, quite satirically, the Church of Perpetual Victimhood. The central claim here is that the Marxist mind virus, having kind of evolved or mutated, now tells you your identity is your oppression.
Right. This is Widdifield's main critique of what is often called modern identity politics. He suggests that the virus has successfully shifted its focus, moved away from the old economic conflict, proletariat versus bourgeoisie, to a purely sociological and personal one. By equating identity with oppression, he argues, the ideology basically requires the adherent to adopt a perpetual victim status. That's how they define and maintain their sense of self. If you're not oppressed, in this view, you lack identity. Therefore, you must find oppression, or perhaps even create it.
And he uses this mechanism to explain perceived cultural confusion. He observes quite pointedly that this dynamic explains why some people can't even figure out what gender they are.
Yeah, that's a powerful, concise move in Marxism, the mind virus of hell. He links a specific, highly visible cultural phenomenon directly to the underlying mechanism of the virus he's described. Widdifield is arguing that when an individual's internal sense of identity becomes entirely dependent on these external markers of victimhood and struggle, then actual self-knowledge gets lost. It has to. The system, as he sees it, incentivizes a search for the most marginalized identity possible, which requires continuous redefinition, continuous searching for offense. The entire worldview becomes dependent on being perpetually offended, because that offense is what validates the required identity.
It's an analysis that connects this sort of existential disorientation directly back to the ideological structure he's outlined. And if the goal is, in this framework, spiritual transformation through victimhood, then the measure of holiness becomes misery. Widdifield argues the more miserable you are, the holier you become in this new religion. Misery becomes the new asceticism, almost a sign of moral purity.
Yeah, this establishes what he calls the liturgy of self-pity. It creates this, well, perverse moral economy where the display of grievance is the highest virtue. This transforms political action from, say, a pragmatic search for solutions into a performative, almost ceremonial ritual. The purpose in this critique isn't really to solve the problem, because solving the problem would eliminate the necessary victim status. The purpose is to maintain the state of misery to prove your holiness within that system.
He encapsulates this perceived absurdity with the satirical beatitude. It's designed to just strip the spiritual weight from the promised reward. He says, "Blessed are the victimized, for they shall inherit free Wi-Fi."
Right. That line is clearly designed to land with a laugh, but the underlying accusation is quite serious. It trivializes the supposed reward for this new kind of holiness. In traditional religion, the reward is huge heaven, spiritual union, enlightenment. Here, the reward is presented as a transient, modern, material, comfort-free Wi-Fi. Widdifield uses this juxtaposition to suggest that the modern promised utopia is cheap, shallow, and ultimately unworthy of the spiritual destruction he claims is required to achieve it.
So having established the liturgy, Widdifield then identifies the modern clergy and sacraments of this new twisted faith he's describing. He points to the high priests as professors with $200,000 degrees in resentment.
Yeah, this identifies the intellectual engine of the virus, in his view. The high priests are the academic elite who have, according to him, monetized and formalized resentment, the $200,000 degree, and they are now charged with creating the doctrines of victimhood. Widdifield is suggesting that modern academia, or parts of it, isn't interested in intellectual exploration, but in the high-cost mass production of grievance.
And their sacraments, their hashtags.
That is the perfect modern contrast, isn't it? A sacrament is traditionally a physical rite that signifies spiritual grace, something profound. Widdifield argues that the modern equivalent, the spiritual rite in this system, is the digital signaling of virtue, the hashtag. This is the mechanism of dissemination, the public display of alignment with the oppressed identity. By calling it a liturgy, he emphasizes that the performance of pity, achieved through these public digital rituals, is the central act of worship in what he calls the Church of Perpetual Victimhood.
So the crux of the argument in this section of Marxism, the mind virus of hell, is basically that the mind viruses has successfully shifted the focus away from objective economic injustice, perhaps, towards subjective psychological performance, where feeling miserable and broadcasting that misery becomes the primary moral objective, outweighing any actual political solution.
Absolutely. That's the diagnosis. It concludes that the energy driving the contemporary movement, as he sees it, is purely internal and psychological, a need for affirmation through grievance, rather than an external search for political solutions. The revolution becomes an internal state of performative protest. It never actually arrives because its purpose is the performance itself. Okay, so now we arrive at the prescriptive phase. Widdifield's proposed cure, which he frames, again very provocatively, as a cultural exorcism 101. But to understand the cure, we first have to revisit his claim about the prerequisite condition. What allows the virus to take hold in the first place? He states very clearly that Marxism only thrives in a culture that has already stopped believing in sin.
That is a really profound claim, isn't it, about cultural decline preceding ideological infection. If a culture loses the concept of moral wrongdoing residing within the human heart, the concept of original sin, or even just personal sin, it creates this massive moral vacuum.
Yes, this concept of the vacuum is critical to his argument. If you remove sin as an explanation, you can't really explain evil or suffering as a result of individual internal moral failure anymore. Therefore, according to Widifield's analysis in Marxism, the mind virus of hell, evil must be explained somehow. The vacuum needs filling. And so the substitution mechanism kicks in. Instead of blaming individual hearts, he must blame external systemic factors, systems, classes, genders, and races.
Right, which neatly reroutes all individual moral accountability onto these external systemic fault lines, which, as Widdifield argued earlier, is the perfect growing medium for the mind viruses of envy and pride. The individual is relieved of responsibility, and the system is deemed entirely guilty.
It creates an almost irresistible temptation, which Widdifield highlights by drawing the stark contrast between the traditional gospel message and the message he attributes to the mind virus.
Yeah, he puts it very bluntly. The gospel says, repent and be transformed, whereas Marxism, in his view, says, riot and be affirmed.
The contrast is deliberately stark, and it centers entirely on internal versus external action, doesn't it? Repentance requires painful personal judgment, internal moral change. Rioting, in this context, requires external action and, crucially, immediate affirmation of one's current state, that victim status we discussed. Widdifield argues the mind virus thrives because it promises all the benefits of moral authority without any of the costs of personal moral transformation.
And he summarizes the devil's appeal, as he puts it, in this powerful triad. The mind virus, according to Marxism, the mind virus of hell, promises justice without judgment, equality without excellence, and heaven without holiness.
That triad really highlights the spiritual shortcut he's describing. Justice without judgment means achieving moral rightness without ever facing your own moral failings. Equality without excellence promises outcome-based parity without the requirement of effort, merit, or achieving anything difficult. And heaven without holiness promises the utopian reward without the necessary spiritual purity or transformation that traditional religion demands. It is, as you said earlier, the ultimate spiritual shortcut, and one that Widdifield argues is entirely deceptive.
Now, it's important to note here that Widdifield doesn't just focus his critique externally. He includes a pretty harsh critique of the church itself. He argues that Christians fell for it. He claims they traded the power of Pentecost for the politics of protest.
Yes, that internal critique is a necessary piece of his argument. It explains why the virus, as he sees it, spread so easily. He's suggesting the church abandoned its unique spiritual power, the power of Pentecost, meaning divine intervention, spiritual transformation, and instead opted for the easier, more temporal appeal of political activism, the politics of protest.
Yeah.
This failure to maintain its spiritual distinctiveness, he argues, made the church susceptible to the very mind virus it should have been inoculating the culture against.
He goes even further, accusing the modern church of watering down its core message to avoid cultural alienation, resulting in buildings that look more like Starbucks.
Yeah, the Starbucks analogy. It's a critique of sort of architectural and aesthetic trendiness over spiritual gravitas, isn't it? It implies that in an effort to be culturally appealing, to be cool, the church traded profound spiritual authority for superficial comfort and relevance. And this loss of distinctiveness, Widdifield asserts, leaves the church incapable of offering the spiritual antidote needed for this exorcism.
So, okay, having identified the cause, loss of belief in sin, and the failure of the spiritual immune system, the trendy church, what is the proposed old-school solution, the cultural exorcism?
Well, the solution he proposes is a deliberate, radical return to fundamental theological principles. Widdifield's action plan is actually quite simple. Start preaching sin, salvation, and sanctification again. That's it. This is presented as the antivirus software. It directly counters the Marxist mechanism, which he says removes sin and affirms the self by reintroducing individual accountability and demanding spiritual transformation, salvation, and sanctification.
And he issues a clear mandate alongside that. Stop trying to impress pagans who have no intention of repenting. This is a direct rejection of that trendy Starbucks-like approach he criticized.
It is. It's a profound call for moral and spiritual integrity over seeking cultural relevance at any cost. Widdifield argues Christianity doesn't need to be cool. Its power comes from its separateness, its moral authority, its distinctiveness from the surrounding culture. He emphasizes this by stating, "The cross isn't cool, it's consecrated." That word consecrated implies something set apart, made holy, dedicated to a sacred purpose. By making this distinction, he rejects the idea that the faith must conform to secular trends to be relevant. It must instead reclaim its spiritual authority. That's the call.
The final step in his framework, then, is to realize the true nature of the conflict as he sees it. He frames the final battle not as left versus right, which he dismisses as just a political squabble, but as light versus darkness.
Right, this fully utilizes his theological framing right to the end. It ensures that the listener understands the immense spiritual stakes involved in the debate. Stakes which, he insists, completely transcend mere policy or political disagreement. By defining the conflict as this eternal struggle, he provides an assured outcome, an assurance of victory, concluding this section of Marxism, the mind virus of hell, with the certainty that the light still wins. #outro.
So this deep dive into Marxism, the mind virus of hell, it's revealed a document defined entirely by its rhetorical strategy, its rhetorical genius perhaps, or maybe its rhetorical ferocity. Widdifield systematically uses these potent theological metaphors, pride, envy, sin, salvation, exorcism, to categorize and frankly condemn an entire political ideology. And in doing so, he performs this radical shift in the frame of the debate, moving it from economic theory to spiritual warfare.
Absolutely. And the key takeaway for you, the learner, is really about the power of that rhetorical reframing. It moves the discussion away from objective policy assessment, away from historical nuance, towards subjective moral and spiritual judgment. It forces anyone engaging with this material to first address Widdifield's definitions of human nature, its propensity for pride and envy, as he sees it, before they can even begin to talk about social justice or economic policy on his terms. It provides this single, coherent, and incredibly forceful theological critique of political philosophy. And it's extremely difficult to counter using purely secular arguments, simply because it operates on a completely different plane of existence.
And Widdifield provides the ultimate concise, concluding analysis, one that roots the argument not in 19th or 20th century history, but way back in deep spiritual history. He ends Marxism, the mind virus of hell, with that powerful summation. Marxism isn't a new idea. It's just Genesis 3 with better PR.
Yeah, that's the ultimate conclusion of his entire thesis, isn't it? It connects the mind virus directly to the story of humanity's original temptation and fall. It suggests the core temptation to reject boundaries, to assert oneself against God or the natural order. It remains the same, regardless of the political packaging or the sophistication of the economic theory. The content of the temptation is ancient, he argues, even if the label is modern.
Which leaves us with the tension the author insists we face every day, the tension he really wants you to mull over. The serpent still says, you will be like God, but the cross still says, you already belong to him. That is the ultimate choice Widdifield presents. Eternal pride versus belonging.